7 again. Wow, we're already on section 10 of our forest ecology series, and you're all becoming real forest stewards. So far, we've gone over the abiotic parts of the ecosystem, right? The laws: light, air, water, and soil. We've also talked about the biotic components of the ecosystem, the producers, consumers, and decomposers, and how they're all classified based on where they get their energy. We spent some time looking at how soil is special, right? It's both biotic and abiotic, with living and non-living components. Well, today I want to look at a group of organisms that are really important to the ecosystem: pollinators. Pollinators are a group of consumers that help plants reproduce by spreading something. What is it? Yep, you guessed it, pollen. So what is pollen? Well, we know it's produced by plants. You may be most familiar with it as the fine yellow powder that magically appears at the beginning of spring to coat every surface, make people's allergies flare up, get them all itchy. Well, if you were to look at the pollen under a microscope, you would actually see a bunch of tiny little grains. Each one of these grains contains genetic information from the plant that produced it, sort of a summary of what makes that plant special and individual. Pollinators are creatures that help move the pollen from one plant to another so that the plants can mix their information all together and create a new plant from the mix. Can you think of any pollinators you already know a little bit about? What are some animals you see visiting flowers? Bees, hummingbirds, butterflies, moths, beetles, bats, birds, and some flies. All those animals are pollinators, and there are even more than that. But why do they do it? Why do these animals go around to all these different flowers? Usually, it's because they get at least part of their diet from the flower itself, either from the sugary water inside the plant called nectar, or from some of the protein-rich pollen itself. To understand why pollinators are so important, we have to dive a little bit deeper into how flowering plants reproduce. That is, how they share their genetic summaries with one another in order to create a new plant. So plants produce flowers as reproductive organs, and if they're pollinated, those flowers will develop into fruit. Most of the fruit and veggies you and I eat come from flowers. If you look at the bottom of an apple, the end without the stem, those little papery bits you see are actually the remnants of the flower the apple came from. Flowers usually have a couple of important parts. Looking into a flower, you can see several stems sticking out. There are a few thinner stems along the outside with dusty yellow-orange bumps on the end, like this. These are called the stamens, and the yellow bits on the end are called anthers. This is where the flower produces pollen, the yellow dust on the anthers. Looking into the center of the flower, you can usually also see a thicker stem with a shiny club-like end, and it might even be a little sticky. That sticky club structure is called the stigma. When pollen touches the stigma, it gets stuck and slowly makes its way down the inside to the wide base of the stigma, called the ovary. Once the two connect, the ovary starts to develop into a fruit. Botanical side note, when I say fruit, I don't just mean the foods that you and I typically think of when we say fruit. When scientists talk about fruit, they mean anything that a plant produces that contains a seed. So things like veggies, things we consider fruits, and nuts are actually all fruit. And fruit are super important. Not only are they vital food sources to many consumers, including us humans, they also contain the plant's babies, its seeds. Without fruit, new plants can't grow. And if a species failed completely to produce fruit, it would go extinct. So if the stakes are so high, and the pollen and stigma are in the same flower, why can't a plant just pollinate itself? Well, some species of plants can do that and be okay, but for most species, it's really important for individuals to reproduce with another individual that's different from themselves. They need to share their genetic summaries to mix things up, otherwise they can start to develop really weird and harmful mutations that make it harder for them to survive, or can even kill them. Some species will recognize their own pollen and reject it, so they can't even form a fruit without another individual's pollen. This is where pollinators come in to save the day. When pollinators visit a flower to eat the protein-rich pollen or drink the sugary nectar, they bump into the anthers and stigma and get pollen all over their bodies. Without trying, they carry it with them when they go to the next flower, where the pollen from flowers they've already visited gets brushed off and can get transferred into the new flower stigma. This way, pollen can get transferred to flowers of different individuals. That's the process of pollination. Over time, plants have developed different adaptations to make pollination more likely and more efficient. Plants want to maximize the amount of pollen that gets brushed onto visiting critters, so some species have spring-loaded anthers that launch pollen onto the pollinators, or sticky pollen balls that get attached onto the backs of visiting pollinators where they can't even reach to clean it off. Plants also really want to attract more pollinators to come get their pollen. Just like many of us, pollinators love sugar, so some plants produce a very sugary nectar to attract visitors. Many pollinators can also see ultraviolet or UV light, so some flowers have runway patterns that reflect the UV light to show pollinators where to go. We can see them under a black light. Without pollinators, most plants wouldn't be able to produce fruit, or at least they wouldn't be able to produce nearly as much fruit. About 1 in every 3 bites that every human takes grew because of a pollinator. They're ecological superheroes. But many of our pollinators are in trouble from habitat loss, overuse of pesticides, competition with invasive species, and new diseases. So how can we be stewards of this amazing group of consumers? Well, like we said, habitat loss is a really big problem for pollinators, so we want to do everything we can to preserve places where pollinators can live. One way to do this is by removing invasive species of plants that don't help pollinators and replanting native plants that do. Another great way to help with habitat loss is by planting native pollinator gardens. These gardens include plants and other features like hummingbird feeders and places for bees to grow their hives, which provide a concentrated area of habitat and food for all sorts of pollinators. We can also help feed pollinators, reduce habitat loss, and use less pesticides by trying to eat locally grown organic foods whenever possible. For our next activity, we're going to learn a little bit more about the pollinators in our area by conducting a pollinator survey. Explore your sit spot in the areas nearby to look for flowering plants. Take note of what plants you find by making a map of the area and putting the flowers on the map. As you explore, also take note of any pollinators you see. It could be a hummingbird drinking nectar out of a flower, or a bumblebee buzzing through the flowers. How many different flowers and pollinators can you find? Are there areas with more or fewer flowers? If you can, visit your survey spot a few times a week and bring your map. How do the flowers change through the season? Are there new flowers blooming or ones that have already finished? Do the areas with the most flowers change over time? Are there changes in the types and numbers of pollinators you see? Make a new map each week if you can and track the changes you observe. If you want, share your maps and observations with us by emailing them to education@mtsgreenway.org. We'd love to see them. And don't forget to watch our next video to learn more about forest ecology. Alright, I'll see you later.